Hey everyone, my name is Marielle Woods. I am a two-time alumni of Salute Your Shorts Film Festival. I had a micro short play in 2017 called First World Problems, and most recently in 2019, my AFI Directing Workshop for Women Spin played. And I am super stoked today to have the opportunity to chat with Ashley Eakin, who is also playing her short from the AFI Directing Workshop for Women.
Yeah, hi, so nice to be here.
So Ashley, you wrote and directed this film.
Yes, I wrote and directed Single, and yeah, I wrote and directed it.
How was the process of from going from script to screen? I really want to talk about how you considered, this is obviously such an important piece when we talk about representation of different kinds of bodies and different kinds of people. And I'm so curious about your process when you were writing that and then seeing that come to fruition on camera.
Yeah, so I was born with a rare bone disease called Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. So I've always lived with a physical disability. And my work prior to this circled themes of being different, but never actually featured people who had different bodies. And I think seeing yourself represented on screen or seeing different body types as, you know, a lead character that a story focuses on is really important. Sure. So I knew for this project that I really wanted to do that. And I actually originally was about to submit something else to the DWW, and I was collaborating with a friend. The story had really nothing to do with disability. It wasn't really working out. And I went on this retreat called She Lift, which is for women with like physical differences and disabilities.
Oh, wow.
And, you know, I've always had this story about like in my mind about dating. And if I got set up with someone who also had a disability, I'd probably be really offended and mad. And I went on this retreat, and, you know, I was super apprehensive to go. And I never really hung out with other people who had disabilities. And I was like, I don't really want to sit around a campfire and like sing Kumbaya about how we're all special. And that was not what it was at all. It was very, these women were like amazing, really cool and edgy. We like drank wine and like had beers and camped, and it was just really cool. And I finally kind of met these people where I'm like, why isn't this community, these type of people reflected in, you know, TV and film and shorts? Sure. And so that's where I kind of was like, it solidified that I should really tell a story that is kind of talking about all these things that we never talk about, like ableism and having like inherent shame about your own identity.
Yeah.
And, you know, that's kind of where I really locked down and like submitted. It was like 5 days until the application was due. And I was like, I'm just going to write this other thing because I'm feeling like I should. And now it's been like 2.5 years of my life, you know?
Wow. It's crazy how that stuff happens.
Yeah.
I particularly was curious in the filming of this project, how cognizant you were of, and I'm sure very cognizant, and how you approached filming the parts of their bodies that might be considered othered, right?
Yeah.
And
yeah, it was
like how you approached close-ups, or I mean, clearly at the beginning of the film, there's the moment of reveal, but particularly I remember when, I forget the male character's name. Jake, when Jake is helping her put her high heel back on, I was curious, like that particular close-up, it felt so smart how you handled allowing the audience to see these bodies, but not in a way that felt exploitative or felt like, like, look at this thing.
Right. You know, and that was something that I'm very cognizant of, because the way that disabilities or different types of bodies are treated in other films, a lot of the time, like horror films, you see something different and they really like zoom in and pan, or a very, you know, quick shot to something that is other. And so I wanted it to feel more natural coming from like her perspective and her POV of how she would maybe look at something. And then there's times where like they talk about her arm and we don't even pan down. I said, I deliberately was like, do not pan down to her arm, because we know, and she knows that she has this. And we don't need to see it again. People got, you know, you're trying to separate that this body isn't completely who this person is.
Yes. While
They're
also contained in a story that is very much about how that body has affected this person's life.
yeah, yeah, exactly. So,
Or also how it has affected, how people's reactions to that body have affected this person's life.
yeah, yeah, it's about that as much as, it's an internal journey, but also showing how the rest of the world reacts to people with disabilities. And it's funny because a lot of people have been like, oh, this is over exaggerated, and I'm like, you have not lived in a disabled body then, because
It
every
felt,
time I go out, I get some type of look or comment or anything, like every single
yeah,
time. And most of the time I ignore it because I'm kind of just like, that's how I live my life. And do I want to be like angry every day?
sure.
But it's very, it's very real. It's
Sure.
very, that's what happens, every day.
I will tell you from an able-bodied person's perspective, it really did not feel at all over-exaggerated to me. In fact, it felt so wonderfully grounded and real in a way that I think told this story, but didn't knock it over the head, and so as a result was so much more powerful. Talk to me about your casting process, because I'm sure there's 1,000 directors out there who, and we see this happen all the time, would cast able-bodied people to play a disabled character
Yeah.
because there aren't enough
Yeah.
actors out there, or XYZ. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. We started, when I wrote this, I wrote it for Jordan Wisely, who is Jake, but I didn't know if he could act. I only followed him on Instagram. I knew he was kind of like on reality TV. He's also a model. I was like, there's no way that this guy can also act, but at least I'll use him in my brain when I'm writing the character.
Oh, delightful.
And, we ended up auditioning him, and he was just so natural and amazing. And then
Yeah,
he
he's
was
great.
like so gracious and let us interview and do chemistry tests with a bunch of different women. And a lot of these women, I was searching since January, and we didn't start shooting until July. So I was doing my own like DMing on Instagram saying, hey, my name's Ashley, I'm a filmmaker. Will you send me a self-tape of you doing this monologue? And people are like, you're crazy. Who are you?
And were you approaching non-actors?
Yeah. I think, me and my casting director, who's also a friend of mine, she's my roommate at one point, we have this discussion a lot about how we think sometimes like acting is almost inherent. Like you're kind of born with this ability to forget yourself. I think,
Mm-hmm.
classes and training can only make you better, but there's some people who have this ability and they don't know it. And I think people with disabilities, for me, for 30 years of my life, I grew up hiding my disability and not wanting to talk about it. So there's no way that I would ever believe that I could act. So,
Right.
and that's a lot of people who have disabilities. Until recently, we've never seen ourselves on screen, or even and now it's like super popular in commercials, which is really cool and huge. I'm a huge advocate for commercials because it's kind of in your face, and you don't even have to sign up to watch it. It's just there on the ad and all these
Yes.
stuff. But so we knew that it would be tough finding this person, and my casting director put out a proper, casting call, and we found Delaney, and she came through, and she was like the only person who really got the nuance and kind of sass of the character
Mm-hmm.
right, which is really important because I kind of wrote her a little unlikable on
Mm.
purpose. And she got that like right away, and then we got to test her with Jordan, and they had really great chemistry. And some of my favorite stuff in the film is like them ad-libbing or improving, and then or even just having side conversations and me saying, okay, have that exact same conversation again and we're gonna film it, and
That's great.
stuff that I really love because they just had a really nice chemistry. So
That's really good. I would never have guessed that you cast him before you cast your lead. That's
yeah,
fascinating.
yeah, I didn't think that was gonna happen, and we just got lucky. So yeah.
Um, Tell me a little bit about how it was to be on a set with probably the most representation of disabled bodies on set that you or even myself would have been on yet.
Yeah. It's really the thing about connecting with other people who have disabilities is you have this kind of like as much as the character in Single gets mad that she's set up with a guy who has a disability, there is a common understanding about that life, you know, and
Yeah.
even though Jordan, who played Jake, he has a different perspective growing up than she did. And it was just so, there's so much that you can't even really describe. And it's these characters could embody these emotions that they've actually lived, which is really important of, you know, just separating yourself from your disability, but also realizing it has shaped every element of your life.
Right.
It's kind of a contradictory concept.
Yeah.
And it was amazing, you know, and hearing their stories about the industry was fascinating. Like Delaney has gone to theater school. She majored in theater, and one of her advisors said, you know, you're never gonna, like, this is fine that you're choosing theater, but you're never gonna have a career because of your arm.
Wow.
And like she was up against people telling her not to do it and still was pursuing it. You know, and Jordan told me about a time that he auditioned for something and they really loved him. And as he was walking out, because he was holding his script, they didn't notice that he was missing, you know, part of his hand. And they were like, wait, what's wrong with your hand? And he was like, oh, like I was just born this way. And they were like, oh, okay. And he left, and they called him that Monday. This is like a Friday. They called him on Monday, and they were like, you know, we've been thinking about your hand all weekend.
Oh, God.
And we think we came up with an amazing solve for it. Like, it got shot off in this battle. And it's just like so funny where you're like, why can't he just be born that way? Why does it have to be some
Why do we
other,
have to script it?
Yeah, like dramatic way of how he lost it, when it's like people are just born different, and that needs to start, you know, to be part of the narrative. So I loved hearing their stories, and then also, you know, just hearing about their experience in the industry and how we can change it moving forward, and kind of explain to people why that's problematic and why, you know, it's still happening in our TV shows. And there was a medical drama that I saw recently where it's like the girl has one arm, which is really cool that she's in the episode, but it has to do with her losing her arm in war. And I'm like, why can't she just have problems with her arm?
Sure.
You know, because it had nothing to do with the war injury. It was more her prosthetic was like giving her an infection or a rash.
I see.
And so it wasn't like, you know, it's just like, why can't it just be that she was born this way? But she had to be like a bitter, angry war vet. And that's what the narrative of people with disabilities has always been, is like they're so depressed or better off dead than be disabled. And
do you find that more often than not, media wants to tell the story of someone who was born able-bodied and then lost a limb versus congenital? I'd love to talk more about that. I've never drawn that distinction, but that does seem very true.
Yeah, and it's very different experience. You know, when you are born with something, it's all you've ever known, and that's your whole life experience. And when you lose something or you become disabled, you are mourning a previous life. So there is a whole added element of, you know, who this person is. And that's why the narrative of disability is so narrow, because a lot of the time it is about someone who is, you know, suddenly disabled, and is having to grapple with like this life that they once had. Where like, for me, I've never been able to like run marathons. I always was the slowest person running the mile in school ever since I was like in first grade, because I've had, you know, over like 28 surgeries on my body. So it's like, I've just have always known that life. And yeah, I can still have insecurities and sometimes wish I was able-bodied. You know, when I was younger, I used to wish that. But now I'm just like, you know, it being able to connect with people. And when you have a disability, it shows you this slice of life that I think is rare. And, you know, I'm in a weird way, I'm like grateful for my disability now. And, you know, it still causes me pain and issues and surgeries, which I don't love. But I think it's really just like, for me, being able to connect with other people and younger people to show them like, you can work on a set, you can go and make a movie, or you can do, you know, work for high level people
or have an acting career.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's the big one, is like them to start to think that they can actually grow up and be the action hero who stars in your movie. You know?
I hope it is okay the way that I phrase this question, but while it is not your job as someone with a disability to educate the world on all of this, you have taken a bit of that mantle on as a filmmaker and someone who is endeavoring to tell stories about that.
Yeah.
So what are some of the bigger takeaways that the able-bodied population should know, or what are mistakes people are making that that we can be better at? I mean, we're in a time right now where a lot of people are doing wonderful self-investigation around things like racism.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we should be investigating all of the above, you know? So I suppose my question to you is what are a couple headlines that you think are important messages to get across?
Yeah. I mean, I think the interesting thing too about, the Black Lives Matter movement is 50% of the people who are inflicted police brutality is a lot of the time the disabled community who are Black, because when there can be cognitive, issues that can, if someone not cognitive or even like the deaf community, when they can't respond because they don't hear the police officer yelling
Right.
at them, then they're, could get violence inflicted on them of thinking that they're resisting arrest when they just can't hear, or they don't know what's happening. So I think, it's interesting to know the intersectionality of disability and that it doesn't discriminate. And it's really just like, it can affect anyone at any time is the
Yes.
crazy part. And so many people ignore it. We all also get old, which is a disability. You're eventually going to have people help you survive and live, and people ignore it, and they don't want to come face to face with, their mortality, I guess, or that loss of youth, with which like our culture is obsessed with. But I think just realizing that people with disabilities are the exact same as you, like who you are. You could have been born just with a different body. And I think that's so hard for people to grasp, that like they're not some othered, like, I don't know, it happened to me as well, because I, for 30 years was basically like an ableist. I had so much shame about my own disability. I didn't want to talk about it. I didn't want to be friends with people who had a disability. And I ended up, starting to hang out with people who have disabilities once I kind of came over and had this identity like revolution, where I realized I actually have kind of like a duty to be a positive representation and show myself and not be ashamed. And I now am friends with so many people with disabilities, and even times where I was unsure of how to interact with people who are completely paralyzed, or like if I meet up for them, do I have to open the door? Like, what do I do? And just realizing that they're human. They've lived this life. They know what they're doing. And, eventually once you have a one-on-one conversation with that person, you're like, why did I ever have some kind of like, bias or stigma built up? And it's really with any underrepresented or kind of like minority community that's different. It's the same kind of, ideology that we're just all human, figuring it out, and complicated. And, I think that's one of the big, takeaways. And then the second I would say is like, be very wary about the way that you are representing this person who has a disability in your film. Are you making them too overly inspirational?
Mm-hmm.
Is their story something we feel sad and just happy that it's not our story?
Right.
Because I used to always get told I was inspiring when I was younger, and kind of just like weird, I wasn't really doing anything. I was just like living. And then you're like, so I'm inspiring to you, but like, what about the person who's being called inspiring? Like, are you happy? Or you just think like, are you happy you don't have my life? Like, it's such a confusing message. And I always tell people, you can tell me I'm inspiring if you're like, it's inspiring the way you've pushed through the film industry and tried to make a career for yourself while having a disability. Like, that's fine,
right.
But I think you can't just have it be like, your attitude is so great for having a disability. And you're like, oh, am I supposed to be depressed?
Yes. Am I supposed to just be sad all the time or angry? Like,
And so it's really, and asking people who have disabilities for feedback is like, everyone has a different way that they want to be addressed. Like, some people will say, I'm fine with being called disabled. Some people will say, I want to be called, a person with a disability. And I used to hate the word disability. I would be so scared of it. If anyone even like barely mentioned my name close to the word disability, I would like cry. And now I'm like, what if we can just revamp the word disability so it has a completely different meaning when people hear it? And even with like me recently kind of pitching ideas and content, I'm very specific on presenting really interesting visuals and kind of edgy representations of disability. Because I think when people instantly hear, oh, she has this, you know, pitch about this person who has a disability, they instantly think like, okay, you know, handicap sticker, which like no one wants to ever say handicap again. And it's just, you know, they think like instantly in a wheelchair, some like uplifting, inspirational story. And you're like, that's not what I want to tell at all. So I always present these visuals that are like disrupting that idea of what it means to have a disability.
Yes.
So.
Yeah. I mean, certainly, I think something that I am even guilty of not doing as much investigation around is your point, the many different ways, the many different congenital disabilities that exist versus things that happen to people. It's all so nuanced. There's so much.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
It's so specific.
Yeah. And I was just in a lab called Respectability, which if anyone listening to this has a disability and wants to be in the Hollywood or film industry, like it's an amazing lab where they actually like have people from different studios talk to us about what they're doing to try and include people with disabilities. And it's like Warner Brothers, you know, NBC was there, Disney, like it's really cool just to hear it on a higher level that they are cognitive, that they are lacking this representation. But you know, that community, it's so fascinating to me because there are people in there who have depression and they have a disability. And then there's people who are completely paralyzed and communicate with a tablet and they have a disability. And then like, I'm somewhere in the middle, you know, like somewhere in there, kind of like, it's just so many different versions of disability. And that's why I'm like, we need everyone to tell stories about disability because the spectrum is so huge, you know? And I mean, I, you know, I'm super passionate about physical disabilities because that seeing something visually different is very new right now. And that's where, you know, normalizing that actually it changes your brain. The like craziest thing that happened to me is when I went to that She Lift retreat, the woman who started it she's missing like the lower part of one of her arms. And she originally had it just for women who had these like limb differences with their arms, basically.
Wow.
And then she opened it up to other disabilities. And that's the year that I went. But majority of women that were there, it was like 15 of us, like most of them had one arm. And what happened to me is it still happens today too, because I was around so many different women who had one arm for so long. If I see someone walking and their bag is covering their arm or, you know, something, it's just bent a certain way, I'm like, oh, they have one arm. Like my brain has normalized it. And I'm like,
so, do you know what's so fascinating?
Crazy.
I had a very similar experience. I only came out as queer about 2 years ago. And about 6 months after that, I went to a camp, which is a camp run by Autostraddle for queer people. And the specifically, I believe, female identifying queer people or LGBTQ, however you identify. But I had such a similar experience because the range of body presentation was enormous. And by the end of that weekend, that it was only 4 or 5 nights, but after that was over, it just made me realize how my brain had normalized all different spectrums. Like I really understood what the word non-binary meant after that week.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
And it made me be like, this is how we solve the world. We just take like one conservative person and we force them to go to this camp and they'll be like, oh my God, everyone's the same.
Yeah. I mean, that's, you know, I think it's, more representation just makes a better world. Kind of everyone feels heard and seen. And I mean, you know, because I worked for John Chu for like 2.5 years, who directed Crazy Rich Asians, and seeing how representation affected the Asian community was so similar to how having a disability, and like I had this video that went on Soul Pancake and it was like went viral, and people were sending me like very similar messages that they were sending my boss. And it was just like representation really does affect how you feel about yourself and your life. And And, you know, growing up for me, I used to always think that I was like going to die. And I don't know, I mean, my disability is not a death sentence. So I was always kind of confused of why I always thought that, but it's because I never saw someone with my bone disease as an adult, or like a wife or a mother, or any, you know, anything as like what we consider like adulthood. And that was just really, you know, powerful when I realized I understood that. And then I found this Facebook group where there were tons of people who had, not tons because it's still very rare, but there was a lot of people, way more than I'd ever seen in my life, who have my bone disease. And I was like, this is what representation means. It's like being able to see yourself, you know, in any capacity. And so that's what I'm all about these days.
Well, your film is awesome, and I'm really glad that I got the chance to talk to you about it. I know we were already connected through the AFI program, but this has been really, really fun because we hadn't gotten to do this yet.
I know, this is so
and
great.
I'm sure I made a mistake or said something perhaps not perfectly at some point, and to those watching, I am learning and want to be told if I messed up. So I'm happy to take any feedback, but this has been awesome. And thank you for making the movie. It's dope. It's just a great film, you know, all in.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And I think we're all learning. I'm learning. I say the wrong things about disability all the time. And I think we have to, you know learn when we're making mistakes and have grace for people, but you know, be willing to change as well. So
yes, for sure. Cool.
Awesome.
All right.
Alrighty.
Good to see you, Ashley.
Bye.